Classic samurai cinema is one of the most influential forms of non-Western cinema on Western cinema's development. Cinema has developed throughout the world in many different ways, and some types of cinema had more bearing than other forms. When it comes to samurai cinema, you can see the influence in Western films as disparate and unrelated to one another as things like Kill Bill and Star Wars. Many of these kinds of intellectual properties were effectively Western interpretations of samurai cinema. And today the topic will be the game Trek to Yomi. This game is another Western marketed product that was heavily influenced by samurai cinema to the point where it has specifically attempted to emulate it as much as possible. So what is Trek to Yomi? The game did receive some fanfare upon release, mostly because of its truly stunning visual aesthetic. But Trek to Yomi is essentially a 2D hack-and-slash game in which you play as a samurai. It features a relatively complex swordplay system, but it does incorporate various other weapons. The main focus is on the swordplay though. Now before we continue, just what is Yomi? This is the name of the land of the dead in Japanese mythology. And the reason for its inclusion is because Trek to Yomi, while being a non-Japanese interpretation of Japanese samurai cinema and culture, is very respectful to the material it is attempting to interpret. That authenticity plays a major role in why it does also do quite well in its emulation of cinematic techniques and influence. However, the interesting thing about Trek to Yomi has nothing to do with Yomi or, to be honest, with the gameplay. It is this emulation of cinema instead. There has long been an attempt by many, different studios over the years to make games that are more cinematic in what they are doing. But what it means to be cinematic seemingly shifts from one developer to the next. In the case of Trek to Yomi, that emulation is specifically in its aesthetics. The game is in black and white, which immediately sets it apart from the vast majority of games, and it does not go for a stylized presentation in terms of the baseline aesthetics. The graphics used are very realistic and attempt to present a gorgeous but real world. The stylization comes from the techniques it copies from cinema. Rather than adopting a stylized animation style, which is what you may expect from many pieces of stylized media, this game instead wants to set itself apart a bit. This is admirable already. A game that uses realistic visuals yet has a stylized presentation is unique on its own, and the dedication to a specific style does distinguish it. Furthermore, the game is generally set in a 2D perspective. Now, the game is not actually a 2D game. The world and models are clearly 3D, and that helps to give them a very realistic visual aesthetic. But the camera continually shifts during combat into a 2D perspective. The reason for this 2D perspective is specifically in service to the emulation of cinema. The fighting takes on the appearance of the silhouette style of fighting that was popularized in samurai cinema. Sometimes you will even find that your character does go behind a screen or something similar, and it does become a literal battle of silhouettes. Ultimately, this is all in service to a sense of authenticity. It copies some of the greatest pieces of cinema to create this specific aesthetic. And the dedication to authenticity by only using Japanese voice actors, adopting Shinto mythology, and placing it in a realistic Edo period setting goes hand in hand with that. The purpose here is to cause the player to specifically think about the relationship between Trek to Yomi and the samurai cinema that it so desperately wants to evoke. When it comes to the actual gameplay, the sword system could be better, but it is interesting enough. Although it does serve its primary purpose in, emulating samurai cinema's aesthetics. I would say it is a game worth playing, but many who have reviewed it have taken a much more mixed reaction to it. However, while many can disagree on whether or not the gameplay itself is worthwhile, most do appear to acknowledge that the emulation of cinema and how it is pulled off is the principal success of Trek to Yomi. However, the dedication to a cinematic presentation shows a certain problem in terms of the development of games. There has long been a fixation on making games more like movies for some reason. And that could come from a certain sense of shame that arises from thinking that cinema is more legitimate form of art than video games. This is certainly how some have thought for a long time. The feeling may finally be shifting for some because, games are now a larger, more profitable industry than film, but this fixation on film does still seem to last. The continuous desire to have games be cinematic is something of a plague on us. While Trek to Yomi does an exceptional job in its presentation, it still suffers from the pitfalls that come with trying to emulate it too closely. For instance, the swordplay, while rather realistic, is not particularly interesting to everyone who encounters it. It wants to be like it is in the movies, but what you see in the movies isn't necessarily all that good to play. It does look good though. The story of the relationship between games and movies is a lengthy one, and games have often been chasing that cinematic appeal in one way or another. But games are a medium on their own that can do things no other medium can do. This is true of every medium. They all do some things well, and they do other things poorly. The emulation of cinema, especially when taken to such an extent as seen in properties like Trek to Yomi, can be impressive, but just trying to be a game may be a better overall attitude to take into game development, rather than, yearning to be more like the reputable big brother that is film.